So the title of my talk today is on the federal deficit spending. And what I'm going to talk to you about today, I want to start off with a pretty general concept from economics. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the saying, but we economists love this saying, okay? It's no such thing as a free lunch. Can anyone tell me what that means? Anyone have an idea? Yeah. Someone else, okay, that's getting at it. Anyone want to take another stab? Everything has a cost associated with it. So if I invite you to go out to lunch with me tomorrow, and I say I'm going to pay for it all, we'll go to a really nice restaurant, we'll have a really good time, there's still a cost involved in you accepting my offer, right? The cost associated with that is all of the foregone other things that you could be doing other than going to lunch with me, even if I'm going to pay for the whole thing, okay? So there's this general idea of an opportunity cost that's associated with all types of actions, okay? Now, when we think about federal deficit spending, when we think about it and hear about it in the news, it's becoming more and more an issue. We've seen all types of situations like what's going on in Greece right now, where federal deficit spending has become such an issue that it's leading to social unrest and violence. Okay? California is not quite there yet, but we're definitely on our way. Okay? And so it's important to understand what the nature of federal deficit spending is and why it's important. Okay? So one of the best things about understanding the federal deficit from an economics point of view is that economics tends to be counterintuitive. Many times, what the layman's understanding of economic phenomena doesn't really map with the way it often is explained in textbooks, okay? With federal deficit spending, it's actually very intuitive. Our colloquial understanding that it's important to live within our means actually holds the same for the state level, the local level, federal level, all the way up. And so there tends to be something very good about that. Okay? One of this is if we know that we're going out and having some current consumption now, if we're going to go out and have lunch today, we know that once the bill arrives, we're going to have to cough up the money. We're going to have to cough up the check, right? Okay, and so we know that we pay for our current consumption now out of our current income at this point in time. Okay, so how does that change when we look at it from a public spending perspective? How is it different? So the idea is that current taxpayers, right, are consuming a lot of goodies now. Okay? We're consuming Social Security, we're consuming new health care reforms, okay? And the bill is not going to come due for those for quite some time. Okay? And so the bill can be pushed on to the future. Now, why is that important? Well, it's extremely important to you guys. Okay? It's extremely important to you guys. Why? Because the bill is being pushed on to you. All right? So current consumption of these large-scale public expenditures form not only the explicit debt that we see in terms of the federal budget expenditures, but also the implicit debt in terms of federal securities that haven't been paid for. And so when the bill gets to you, it's going to be much, much bigger. Okay? It accrues this interest payment over time, and it also accrues with the implicit debt obligations of Social Security and Medicare. Okay? So the most primary lesson to understand when we're thinking about federal deficit expenditures is that public debt obligations shift the burden of the payment of these goods onto future generations. All right? So that's the primary point. Now, what's the cost of that? Okay, what's the cost of that? Public debt, the primary cost is that it stifles entrepreneurship. It sets up a set of conditions under which it makes it very difficult for entrepreneurs to engage in successful investment for the future. Okay, so public debt is extremely detrimental when we're looking at the growth of an economy over time. Okay, so I want to ask this question of why is it that federal deficits are so hard to understand? Why is it from a public perspective they seem difficult to comprehend? And I'm going to give you 3 reasons. The first reason has to do with this idea of fiscal illusion. Okay? So the idea that public spending tends to propagate this notion that we can get something for nothing. Okay? And there's a lot of very sensible reasons as to why fiscal illusion exists. The second reason I'm going to talk to you about is just poor economic theory. There was a lot of really bad economic theory out there that facilitates politicians engaging in a lot of debt expenditure. So we'll talk for a minute about that. And then the third one is, again, related to this idea of fiscal illusion, but centers more on the idea that it's hard to comprehend exactly the opportunity cost, the foregone goods that we're giving up when we accept a lot of these large-scale public spending initiatives. Okay? So the first one is this fiscal illusion. Because the current group of taxpayers who are consuming these goods and not paying the full cost of those goods, they're seeing that they can engage in a level of consumption that otherwise they really couldn't, right? So a lot of this consumption is being financed under the illusion that we can afford it when otherwise we really couldn't. Okay? And how is this possible? How is this possible? Well, we have politicians, okay? We have politicians who have very, very short time horizons, okay? Politicians under democratic conditions face term limits. And term limits set their time horizon such that, typically it's between 4, if they get reelected, 8 years, okay? But in the grand scheme of things, it's a very time-constrained notion. And so what does that mean? It encourages current consumption now, right? Promises for building more schools, having more health care, engaging in large-scale infrastructure projects at the expense of the future, okay? So the tendency is for politicians to want to spend now and not levy the taxes necessary to finance those expenditures now, okay? So this is a general tendency that arises because of the public nature of the expenditure and the short time horizons being faced by those who are in decision-making positions. And so we have this, again, this tendency in the public sphere to want to buy now and pay later. Okay. The second has to do with this poor economic theory. Okay. So one of these poor economic theories that was propagated a lot during the 19th century was this idea of Ricardian debt equivalence. Ricardian debt equivalence is just a fancy way of saying that economists came up with a lot of rationales as to why it was equally good to finance public expenditures through taxes and through debt. Okay? And essentially this Ricardian debt equivalence idea rested on the notion that the people who consume the public goods now, okay, are the same people who will pay for them later. Okay? That was the assumption of the Ricardian debt equivalence idea. Okay? So people who consume the goods now actually pay the bill for them at the same time. Okay? But what the whole notion of public choice economics brought into perspective is that many times the current taxpayers who were voting for the public goods expenditures did not incur the cost of those at the same time in which they actually made the votes to engage in those public expenditures, okay? So they were able to say, yes, I will vote. I want a public infrastructure project. I want increased Medicare benefits, right? But I want them so long as I can pass the bill on to the future, okay? So this was this challenge to the Ricardian debt equivalence idea. The second poor economic policy that really propagated the notion that it was okay for the public coffers to engage in all of this debt-financed consumption had to do with this idea of the Keynesian multiplier theory. And believe me, this one's alive and well, okay? Because we have all of the stimulus spending that we engaged in over the last year was also under this notion of the Keynesian multiplier theory. And what did that say? All the Keynesian multiplier theory has to say is that when government spends $1, okay, as opposed to when private industry spends $1, when the government spends $1, it gets multiplied in the economy. And so whenever the government spends money, it actually creates more and more spending. Okay? And this is a dubious theory for a number of different reasons. Okay? Exactly how the government can spend a dollar more effectively than the private sector can spend a dollar is it's a very dubious notion. What's more likely is that for every dollar that the government takes out of the private economy, there's one less dollar in the private economy to spend. Okay? And it's just as simple as that. And so we had these ideas of, we had poor economic policy, okay, that was fostered by two very poor economic theories as to how public debt should work. Okay? So the third one that I'm going to talk to you about, the third reason why it's very hard to comprehend public debt, is that we're not very good at assessing the weight of large numbers. Okay, we're not very good at understanding the weight of large numbers. Okay, so when we hear that the government, when Obama passes his $100 million spending cut, what do we hear? We hear he's taken a big pile of money out of an even bigger pile of money. Okay, and we have no real way to gauge how much is really going on. Okay. Furthermore, what's even more difficult from a consumer's perspective, and this is where the economic way of thinking can highlight the aspects of federal deficit spending, is that it's even more difficult for consumers to understand the opportunity cost of those dollars if they weren't taken away and spent on these public large-scale projects. Okay, so the opportunity cost of your tax dollars can be more iPods, but it also could be more health care, more R&D investment, all of these different things. So understanding the true cost of federal deficit finance involves having to think about what the opportunity costs of those dollars are. Okay, and so I had this YouTube video that I was going to show with you. I think I'll skip it, but it's a good one. I'll put a link up on the website. But it's very good at showing how you assess the differences in spending. Okay, so finally, why is it that if the colloquial understanding that we should live within our means, if this logic holds true for the individual, the state, all the way up to the federal government, then how is it that we're stuck in these situations? Why is it that Greece, 4 or 5 people have died in Greece as a result of the protests that have arisen over the federal deficit finance problem that they are having there? Why is it that California is in such dire straits? Okay? The answer to that question lies in the nature of special interests. Okay? So what the public choice understanding of deficit finance shows us that special interest groups, very small groups of people, okay, that are very good at getting politicians to listen to them, okay, can impose costs, very large costs, on taxpayers who are very dispersed and unorganized. And it's this nature of collective action, this nature that small special interest groups can concentrate the benefits that public finance can leverage on them, while diffusing the costs onto the taxpayers, perpetuates this continual spending spree. Okay? So are we at a loss? Are we totally without remedy? Okay? And in some ways, these problems of deficit finance do pose large-scale problems in terms of the rules of the game. Okay? So the institutions that govern our economic activity have to dramatically shift. Okay? So one of the ways, we don't have to be completely pessimistic. Okay? Many of our institutions, many of our informal norms, many of our morals, okay, support this notion that it's ethically right to live within your means. It's morally right to live within your means. And a lot of our Western traditions, especially in terms of classic public finance, really uphold this notion. Okay? We can look to thinkers like Adam Smith, who have regularly thought about how it is that we can constrain the state to live within its means. Okay? And so a lot of smarter people than I have devoted a lot of time to thinking about this and thinking about how it is that we can constrain the state, okay? Keep it from predating on individuals while still providing some of the protective and the productive services that the state can supply. And these two Nobel Prize winners have come up with this idea of a balanced budget amendment. Okay, so looking to the future in order to constrain the state, we would want to leverage some general amendment such that when the public voters go to vote on a particular spending project, make it such that the spending for that project must be leveled at the exact same time. Okay, on the exact same people that are going to benefit from the project. And so what does this do? It constrains the voters to only vote for those projects which they themselves are willing to pay for, and that will generally benefit everyone who's forced to then pay for those projects. Okay, so the generality condition is important. It has to treat all individuals who are going to pay into this equally, right? And the simultaneity constraint is also the important part. All expenditures have to simultaneously be passed with a provision on how they will be financed. Okay, and so I think that understanding some of the ways in which constraining the state through rules and general rules can seek to eliminate these problems in the future is a very productive way to begin to think about reform and the reform process.